Hey everybody, how's it going? Corey here from Themeco with a grid layout breakdown for you all. So in today's video, I want to discuss some of the techniques that I'm using to bring this whole section together that I've created for Design Cloud. There's a lot of interesting things going on here. From the general positioning of our content, you'll see that this background layer that's spreading to the far edge of the screen is actually a cell that I've put behind these two feature boxes here. On top of all that, because I knew I needed a lot of control over the spacing between these elements and how it would work responsively, I'm actually doing some really intricate stuff here with the grid template. And I'm using this to create my overall spacing and the gaps between my content instead of using the actual gap control down here. So we'll discuss kind of why you might want to use that for certain designs. And then finally, there's actually a really unique little trick that I'm using to kind of give my content a max width on much larger screens. You'll see that it stops right here and doesn't keep spreading out. But we're not using the global container. And I did that because I need this particular cell here to spread to the far edge of the screen. So we'll just kind of break all these little things down piece by piece, walk you through why I made the decisions I did. And I just think overall there's a lot of things you can take with you into your builds moving forward. So let's just jump right in. So before we start anything in particular, I just want to kind of discuss the general approach I was taking to this design and what I wanted to see come out of it, because it really is the sort of vision you have for your design overall that will dictate the certain features you use and how you implement them in your design. One main feature of this particular design that was important was to have this background layer that spread from the center of the screen to the far edge of the screen on my large and extra large breakpoints. And you'll see that no matter how big my screen gets, that image is always spreading out to the side. So I knew I needed that, and then for my content to sit on top of it. And then I wanted to kind of play around with this background layer and have it moving around. You'll see that responsively on our kind of tablet view here, it's now positioned down in the lower left corner, but still behind our cells. And then if I keep sizing, we'll see we've got a similar approach here, just spanning more vertical space since everything is now on its own line. And then finally, on the smallest screens, that background layer spreads the entire width of the screen. So I knew that I was going to be moving this layer around a lot, and I would need a lot of control in the template itself to do that. It was because of that very reality that I opted to not use my global container on this grid. And the reason being is, if I turn this on, you'll see that my whole grid is now constrained by that global container. I can't have this image spread out to the side of the screen without using any custom CSS. So it is possible, we just have to get in there and tweak it a bit. And I wanted to do this completely native just within the tool itself. So let's turn our global container back off, and then we'll jump up here to our grid layout. And I actually want to start with the rows because the concept I'm using here will translate into my columns, but this is, I think, a little simpler to take in, and that will make breaking this section down a little easier. So let's start with our rows here, and I'm actually going to turn my cell layout editor on just so we can visualize it a little better. You'll notice for my large and extra large breakpoints, we've got 3 values. They're a little different between each, but they're effectively the same idea. Here we've got 80 pixels, auto, 80 pixels. So what I'm doing with this is, instead of using padding on my grid or my section to get this vertical spacing, I'm actually kind of creating some spacing using the template itself. And again, the reason why I did this here is because I knew that I wanted my image to not only span the entire width of the screen here, but I wanted it to span to the top and bottom of my grid respectively. So I need this spacing not only to move my content away from the edge here, but to kind of get this look realized in the way that I wanted to do it. So what this row template is effectively doing is saying, give me 80 pixels on top, and then have auto spacing in the middle. Effectively, no matter how many times my text lines wrap or if my images grow or shrink, this spacing is responsive. The height will change based on what I need it to be. And then I end it off with another 80 pixels. Now, the really nice thing about this is I can of course come in here, and if later on I decide I needed a lot more spacing, I could simply change these two values, and now you'll see that my background layer is still spanning from top to bottom to the far edge of the screen, and my content here is put perfectly in the center, but all I've done is change these values. So that's kind of the first important concept right there. Once you get your template ironed out and all of your content placed on that template, you can update these values, and the content inside that template should shift around as it needs to if you've placed it using some proper values here. So that's a really nice and handy and flexible way to set things up. And you'll see that on my extra large screens, again, I'm keeping the same idea here. I've just bumped these values up just a little bit. So let's kind of keep with our rows template for the time being, and let's jump down to our tablet screen here. So let's open up our manage template section here. It's a little bit easier to see since we've got a lot of values, and let's break this down. So we've got 6 rows here. We've got 65 pixels, auto, 65, 65, auto, 65. So what I'm using here is this value of 65 is kind of my general gap I want vertically between things. So we've got 65 at the top here, then we've got our value of auto, which will allow the text in here to either shrink or expand as it needs to. Then we've got two values of 65 here. And again, this was kind of down to how I was visualizing the layout functioning, but I knew I wanted these cells to be 65 pixels away from here, but then I kind of wanted to keep that same spacing from the top of these feature boxes to this background layer being behind everything here. So we're using this double value of 65 here to give me another line where I can space this background layer out with. Next, we're using our auto value for our content to sit into, and then we've got 65 pixels at the bottom. So hopefully you're kind of starting to see a pattern emerge here. I can use these templates themselves to create the gaps that I need either horizontally or vertically. So let's just keep going down. We'll go down to our small breakpoint, open this up, and it's much of the same thing. I'm still using this 65 pixel value. I just like the general spacing of it all. And I've got 65 here, so that's here. Auto for the text. And then again, you'll just see that I'm adding gaps where I need to, but now that I've gone down to one line, I have one more value of auto here to account for this cell. And then this is effectively the same layout on our smallest screens. So that's the idea behind the rows templates. We can actually work our gaps into the template itself without having to use this gap control. And the nice thing about that is since we can update these values responsively, I have full control over the spacing between my elements on every screen size. So now that we've got that general concept under our belt, let's take a look at our columns template here on our large breakpoint. It's fairly straightforward. We've only got 3 values, but this repeat statement is doing a lot of the work for us. But basically we've got 4 VW to the outside of our columns, and that's this space right here, 4 VW. And remember that VW stands for viewport width. So this is effectively 4% of the viewport overall. Now again, I could have chosen a fixed value if I wanted, such as pixels or rims. I just wanted this to be a little bit more dynamic and shrink or expand depending on the size of the screen that's viewing the layout. Now right here is where the real fun starts. So we've got this repeat statement that we've used in some of the videos we've talked about before, and I'm basically repeating everything in this second parameter 6 times. So let's break it down. We've got 1 rem, 1 FR, 1 rem. Repeating that 6 times. So let's go down here to our template, and we can see that pattern working. We've got 1 rem right here, 1 FR, and then 1 rem. Now we repeat that again. 1 rem, 1 FR, and then 1 rem. Now the reason why I chose to use this particular pattern, again, goes back to my overall design that I was trying to accomplish. I wanted this background layer to be able to be positioned in the direct center of my grid and then go to the far edge of the screen. So if I was just repeating 1 rem with a gap in between, and I didn't have this line in the middle here, I wouldn't be able to line up that background layer the way I needed to. The great thing about using these repeat statements too is that I can simply come in here if I wanted to, and I can start playing around with different values. So I might use 2 rims instead if I wanted a little more spacing between all my content. Again, it's kind of like our value of 80 pixels here for our rows. Once we get everything placed on our grid template, then we can simply come back here and change these values and fine-tune it exactly how we want. So using this particular approach allowed me to space out my columns in 3 like this. Let's jump down here to our medium breakpoint. Take a look at our columns template. We've got our 4 VW to the outside again. Now we're using the same pattern. We've just done 4 repeats now instead of 6 because I knew that I effectively wanted 2 columns side by side for these features down here, and then for this to just pop up top. So we've done 1 rim, 1 FR, 1 rim, which you can see right here, 1 rim, 1 FR, 1 rim. Repeated it 4 times, and that gives us our 2 columns. And then we still have these lines running straight down the center of these columns here where I can position my background layer as such. So you'll see that background layer right to the middle and then running down to the edge of the screen. If we size our screen down just a little bit more, you'll see everything go to 1 column effectively. We can pop this open. And now, since I'm just kind of getting a little more fine-tuned with my smaller breakpoints, there's no more repeat statements because I'm really just setting everything up once that I need it to be. So we've got 11 VW here for this outer spacing. Again, just a personal choice I made. And then we're using our value of 65 pixels here for this outer spacing. And that just matches the spacing that I've been using for my rows here. And the reason why we picked that is, again, coming back to our background layer. I wanted to have it 65 pixels away from the edge of this cell, just like it's 65 pixels away from the top here. And then our value of 1 FR in the center allows us to span all of the available space we have left. And that's effectively what's going on our small viewport, except we're just doing 8 VW, 1 FR, because at this point, we knew that we wanted to have this background layer just span the whole width, so we didn't need the extra values of 65 pixels or anything to place it. So again, it really just comes down to your overall vision for the layout and kind of thinking through what you need for each breakpoint and then setting up your template as such. Now, there's a really fun thing I actually did on the extra large breakpoint, again, to get the template set up so I could spread this background layer to the edge without using a container. And it basically looks like this. So this might look a little crazy, but remember that this repeat statement is the exact same from our large breakpoint, so nothing different there. But all I'm doing here for these outer columns is I'm using a little bit of CSS magic, if you will, to effectively give me a max width without using a container. So let's just break it down one bit at a time. And remember that these calc statements allow us to combine different units. So you'll see I'm using VW and pixels together. All right, so before breaking this down, I wanted to take a little screenshot here so that we could kind of keep these values front of mind while I show this to you on an actual extra large breakpoint so we can see everything here. So again, let's look through our statement here. We've got calc 100 VW minus 1100 pixels and then dividing that by 2. So why would we do that? Well, think of it like this. You can always equate this 100 VW value to an actual pixel value. For example, if I just do a quick measurement here, my screen is about 1400 pixels wide on this particular screen that I'm looking at it on. So you can think of this as 1400 pixels minus 1100 pixels, so that gives us 300 pixels, and then we're dividing it by 2. So we ultimately end up with, on this particular screen, 150 pixels is basically what this calc statement is giving us at the end of the day. Now, if I start from the edge of the screen here, and I measure over about 150 pixels, you'll see that we're not quite there, but remember, if I close this back down and we look at our template, from our repeat statement, we've started with this 1 rim gap here. So So you've got to remember that for an extra large breakpoint, we've got 150 pixels and then this one rim space. And again, if I measure my 150 pixels over, you'll see that gets us right to about where the one rim starts. So the really great thing about this is you'll see that even if I start zooming out on my screen here, my content here doesn't keep getting wider, but my background image keeps spreading to the edge of the screen. And again, that's because I'm using my template to define everything in here from screen edge to screen edge. That gives me the ability to place this image here, but then this little bit of CSS wizardry here is what keeps our content from expanding and just looking super goofy on a really big screen. Now this value that I picked here of 1100 pixels is purely arbitrary. It's a rough estimate of where I'd like to see the max width for my content be. But you will notice that if I measure this, it's not an exact 1100 pixels. In fact, it's right at about 32 pixels short of being 1100 pixels. And the reason why that is, again, goes back to our little one rim gap here. So since we've got two one rim gaps on either side of our content here, we could also subtract two rims from this, and that should give us a true 1100 pixel value in the middle here. So just a super nuancy thing, but you can effectively use this as a very rough estimate just to get you in the ballpark of where you want to be, and then you can match these to be exactly what you want them to be. So that is all effectively the general idea behind the reason why my grid layout templates are set up the way they are here. It all comes back to how I wanted this background layer and my content as a whole to be placed on the template. I knew I wanted 3 columns for large and extra large, and to have this in the center and span over. I knew on a tablet view, I'd like to have 2 columns here and to be able to move this behind all that. And then I was just visualizing that all the way down the chain, down to my small and extra small breakpoints as well. So kind of the first important concept there is that we can use our grid layout itself to create our gaps. And when we have full control over those gaps on all breakpoints, we have even more detailed control over our layout as a whole responsibly. And it really all starts and ends with that, because once I have this template defined, I can then come in here and start placing my cells in the manner in which I see fit. And the great thing about using these templates and then placing our cells on sort of the coordinates of that template is that they are very flexible to use for different patterns. For example, if I wanted to, I could make an alternate of this template that maybe only had one feature box here. And so to do that, I might start by getting rid of this one altogether, and then maybe taking this box here, resizing it over. And again, because of the general way that I've set up my template, everything is sizing out the way I want it to, because here's our auto row that's allowing the content to grow. And if I turn this off, you'll see we've got a similar kind of look here. We've got the background layer in the center moving to the edge, but maybe instead of the center of the screen, I'd like to have it in the center of my column here. Well, because of the way I set up my repeat statements, I could come up here to my background layer and simply move it over, turn this off, and now you'll see we've got our background layer here spanning to the edge of the screen still, but with just our one feature here for a little bit of a different take. Alternately, I could turn this back on, size this back down, put my background layer over here. I can make an alternate version where all of this is flipped. So I could drag my background layer over here, take my shapes are great, place it here, circle, and rhombus. And you can see that it's that quick to move our content around using the coordinate system with the grid. This right here, I really can't stress it enough. The cell layout, being able to place these cells however you see fit on your grid, is where grid really shines. It gives you true declarative control over the structure and layout of your pages. And as you saw just here with this example, we can very easily shift things around once we've set up a general rule for our layout. And while this can be a lot to do manually, having the cell layout editor at hand is an invaluable tool to quickly move things around, try resizing layouts, seeing if you like that general flow or not, and then putting things back. It's just such a no-brainer to use tools like this to experiment quickly and ideate and then get something out that looks great. Now, just a few final notes on this layout as a whole. While my cells are being stretched out here, this content won't automatically go to the bottom of a column like this. To get that working, what I'm doing is I've got my Flexbox layout turned on for my cell. I'm using a column layout, so it's working its way down the cell. And I've just got it aligned vertically and horizontally to the start. Now, what I'm doing is I've got some spacing here at the bottom of my headline, 4 ems, but at the top of this line, you'll see that my margin value is auto. And it's those auto margins, and I've talked about this in a previous video with Flexbox positioning, but when we've got a Flexbox powered element, we can use these auto margins to push things away even vertically. So that's what's giving me this bottom alignment here of this content, but this top alignment up here with all of this. And you'll see that I'm doing a similar thing for my feature boxes here. You'll see that my headline has wrapped to a third line at this point, but my button over here is still at the bottom. Normally this would bump up since it's supposed to be aligned at the bottom of the text. However, the top of each of my buttons is using the auto margin trick, so I'm pushing this button all the way to the end of that column. Finally, remember that over here in our headline, I had a little bit of bottom spacing at 4 ems, and the reason why I have that in place is for effectively this view. When it responds into a 2-column setup here, but this is on its own line up here, I still want to have a little bit of space just to give it the look I was going for. So again, I'm kind of thinking globally, and how can I set up things for my elements so that they will just automatically fall into place when they go down to their breakpoint. So while you won't see this bottom spacing here at all, because this auto margin is pushing it far enough away that it's greater than 4 ems, on these smaller viewports, you do get just this little bit of spacing, and it works great to fit into its auto cell position on the grid track. A couple other little details that I think are kind of fun is, since I'm actually using a physical cell here for this background layer, which again, I've just put a kind of hero image on here, and it's covering that whole cell. So that image will expand and contract the way it needs to based on the layout. But since I'm using this actual cell, I can actually place a box shadow on it. And you'll see there's a very subtle amount of shading going on here that just gives a little bit of depth that perhaps if you didn't have it, it would fall a little more flat. But I think it's those little details that really help things kind of layer nicely. And I've got a similar shadow that I'm using on these cells as a whole that all this content is in. The content inside these cells is effectively just an image that is spanning the entire width of the cell, so that's why these grow and contract as the cells get bigger and smaller. Got a headline here with a main headline and a sub-headline, and then of course just a simple button kind of keeping the spacing, the inside of the cell here, and it's got kind of an invisible background here. It's just giving you a bigger hitbox for your mouse to hit and take your users off somewhere else. And all of these cells, of course, spanning the entire width for situations like this, or height, is due to our item setup, which is using stretch both horizontally and vertically. That's really it, just a super quick breakdown of this template. There's a bit going on, but hopefully after seeing it, you can see that everything is very purposeful. And the great thing with Grid is that we can be very declarative with our layouts. And so there's no more kind of adding up percentages in our brains and imagining things working. We can use our special syntax like 1FR to fill gaps where we need it to. We can use our viewport widths. We can use our templates to create gaps. We can really just envision something and then finally be able to just declare it to the browser, and the browser will render it out for us. So hope you guys enjoyed that. Look forward to seeing how you all take these concepts and apply it to your own builds going forward.